It's not calling you Josh Frydenberg, it's calling you Dosh Frydenberg.
Under the Coalition, taxes for hard-working Australians will always be lower.
You know, I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in control room.
They're answers that only can come from Victoria, I'm afraid, because that's not my job.
But I ain't spending any time, though, because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person is torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
Well, g'day and welcome to Hard Hats and High Viz, and it's episode 18. And joining me, as usual, is Hong Kong Jack. How are you, mate?
Excellent, Jack. Good to hear from you.
Yes, and I am Jack the Insider, as you well know. And I just want to kick off our program by reminding our listeners, as per usual, that we love to hear from you. We got some letters this week, and we'll be going through them. But we'd love to hear from you. Criticisms, comments, remarks, questions, anything you like, scathing, defamatory abuse we'll even deal with. And you can drop us a line at the Conditional Release Program at gmail.com or hit me up on Twitter. And my DMs are always open at Jack the Insider. Well, Jack, here we are, 15th of August. There's lots going on. But what caught my eye were the Packer emails. This is a series of emails that Jamie Packer sent that alleges... Well, yes, well, I guess we have to call it an allegation that James paid former Treasurer, now Chairman at Nine Media, with a $300,000 commission to get him closer to the then gaming minister, Michael O'Brien, Jack.
300 large. Nice check.
300 large. Wouldn't the ATA be going, let's have just a quick flip through the tax returns there just to see what's there?
Yeah. Well, I'm sure it'll be there, you know.
Oh, well, yes, so I wouldn't presume any otherwise, but it would probably be worth having a look all the same. Yes, so a secret lobbying fee being paid. So Michael O'Brien, I believe, is back now. He's spent some time. He's a former leader of the opposition, former Marshall and Boyd too, Jack.
Is he? Oh,
yeah, I think he is. Yeah, pretty sure. And of course, he was the... there's no suggestion in any way that he's misbehaved, but he was leader of the opposition, and then...
but then who hasn't been leader of the opposition in Victoria? They've all had a go, haven't they?
Well, they do have a bit of a merry-go-round approach to it all, and I think he's Shadow Attorney General at the moment because... unsurprisingly, the rest of the front bench there in Victorian Liberal Party or Coalition is basic. No one had a law degree, so they had to give him the gig. They had to get him back from the cheap seats, and now he's back there. So it's no suggestion in any way that he was involved in anything undue, but it would seem that James has paid, at least he claims he has, paid Peter Costello $300K. Can I just read some of these emails to you? I presume some of our listeners have already seen them. This is a direct email to Peter Costello. You were my secret Crown lobbyist, Peter. In 2011, I personally paid you $300K. CPH, in brackets, did anyway. You didn't want the Crown directors to know. To lobby for me for Crown. Your job was to get me closer to Michael O'Brien. And then he goes on with a bit of a character assessment. You're one of the biggest hypocrites I've ever met in my life, Peter. I think you should resign from your public positions and get on with your life again after you do that. Wow.
Ouch.
Ouchie, wow. And then on to James Chesil, who's also on the board at Nine Media. He says, you remind me of your chairman, Costello. I think, no, you both lack transparency, integrity and character. I am staggered that your moral compass points so far away from true north. I have nothing but contempt for you, James. Please do not contact me again unless it's with a lawsuit, which I would relish. Just FYI. Fuck off out of my life. So that's a pretty blunt assessment.
Yeah. I sort of read them and thought, we know he's had some mental health issues. Was he in the middle of a sort of a mental health episode?
Yeah, these are all dated July. And according to my reading of matters around James, that he's in pretty good nick at the moment.
Yeah, well, it could be, yeah, but it's just all a bit odd, really. Yeah.
Yes, well, look, the very first email reads, I trust everyone on this email chain except James Chesil, and on the chain with Peter Fitzsimmons, Lisa Wilkinson, Carl Stefanovic, James Chesil, who got mentioned, Joe Aston from the Fin Review, Andrew Denton, of course, and Matthew Grounds, who I don't know. I trust everyone on this email chain except James Chesil, who I think lacks transparency, lacks integrity, and lacks character. For the record, Crown Unmasked was a great story, great journalism in the best sense. I will always be ashamed that some of the bad things that happened at Crown happened on my watch. Nick McKenzie definitely knew more about what was really happening at Crown than I did, and he's referring there to the investigative journalist, Nick McKenzie, who's a very, very fine investigative journalist. And we'll get to some of his latest work lately. So what happens now, Jack?
He's in form, isn't he, Nick McKenzie?
He's got plenty to do with, Jack. Does Costello have to respond to this?
I would say no.
Well, you just let it go. Just let it hang there.
Yep.
Yeah, okay. All right. I'm not sure. I think a chairman of a media organisation would have to come out and say, I did or I didn't. I wasn't chair at the time, and I'm not quite sure what he was up to in 2011. But these are all emails dated between the 23rd and the 24th of July of this year from James Packer. Anyway, yes, he knows how to give you a slapping on email. We know that now. So we'll see what eventuates and whether Peter Costello actually responds. There's no because he wasn't a member of Parliament, there's no question that of him being a secret lobbyist would breach any sort of laws or indeed any sort of protocols. If he got 300 large from James Packer to cuddle up to Michael O'Brien, that's, it might be a bit unseemly, but there's actually nothing wrong with it.
No.
Oh.
Can't see anything wrong with it myself. I just don't see an upside in Costello getting down and getting into the bear pit and having a wrestle with James Packer over this.
Put the bat up, just let it go through to the keeper.
Yep.
All right. Now, over the weekend, there was a double murder in Sydney. 2 women were shot dead, and one who has organised crime links, although there's no suggestion that she's in any way has any sort of criminal history or background herself. As the mother of 2, Lametta Fadalla, 48, and hairdresser Amy Hazuri, 39, were murdered on Saturday night in Reeves, and there was extraordinary audio picked up by a very fine young journalist at the Australian by the name of Liam Mendes. Does fantastic work. It would seem that 8 rounds were fired, so that would tell me that they basically emptied the clip. The shooters emptied the clip. And look, it's a terrible crime, of course, but this is what interested me about it. Superintendent Doherty from New South Wales Police said there is no evidence at all that it's linked to the current conflict. That's the sort of gang wars that have consumed Sydney's West, killing 11 people in 2 years. He says there's no evidence at all that it's linked to the current conflict or any other conflict. We have to look at this matter on its own. Of course, Superintendent Doherty goes on to say, we keep our mind open to any other links or any other types of conflict, but at the moment there is no information or evidence to suggest that it is involved in Sydney's gang wars. But the motive for this one still is unclear, says Superintendent Doherty. It appears to be a targeted attack. It appears the 48-year-old woman has had some links in the past, but we've obviously got to look at our current relationships and business associations. Her previous relationships, her previous associations. They're the things we're doing now, and we're determined to get answers. He went on to say, and this is the thing that interested me, Jack, New South Wales Police Superintendent went on to say, criminals just don't care about old underworld norms, and we're now attacking women and family members of their targets, which is true. It's really unusual, he said. There used to be an unwritten law with the criminal element, especially in organised crime. Criminal element, you don't touch family, you don't touch women, he said yesterday. I think that the rules of engagement have been thrown out the window. It's disregarded now. Is that true, Jack?
Well, you're the expert on this sort of crime. Unwritten rules, though, they're kind of not very reliable, are they?
But it certainly was. There's a long history of this, and we can go back to the sort of Chow Hayes in Sydney days, that there was a line of demarcation that never involved family. Wives, children, families were kept out of it. As old Chow himself used to refer to squareheads, and they were non-combatants. They were people, you could rob them, but the violence and so forth stayed within the lines of the criminals themselves. You could bash, you could stab, you could kill the criminals themselves. But I'm not sure that this, with that Chow Hayes period goes well back into pre-World War II days. and beyond. But I'm not sure that we've always had that.
That goes back to the Razor Gang days, really. It goes well before that.
Yeah, look, I can tell you that there was a murder in 1982 of Sue Smith and Terence Basham up in Murwillumbah. Both of those were executed, almost certainly by Chris Flannery. And that was a particularly appalling crime. But when Chris got in there, Smith and Basham had been involved in a drug trafficking group that had links with painters and dockers in Melbourne. In fact, Basham was a painter and docker himself, and they'd sort of gone out on their own. And the criminals involved had obviously called for their execution. Now, Flannery broke into the place, and they were there. He shot dead Sue Smith and Terence Basham, and they had a two-year-old child, Jack. And Flannery basically put the child into the cot and covered her with a blanket and went on his way. So he'd sort of broken one rule, but then retained the other one. And then a call was made within about 24 hours to Smith's father, who travelled down from Brisbane to Murwillumbah and found the child had been left there for about 36 hours. The child's now living in the UK and has come out and spoken about. She has no memory of the event, of course, but has come out and spoken about what it's like to lose your parents in such grisly, violent ways. So I would disagree with Mr. Doherty, or Superintendent Doherty, that the rule book had been thrown out.
In any event, early days of an investigation, shouldn't be leaping to too many conclusions at this stage.
Yes, look, it's going to be a very comprehensive murder investigation. It is a most appalling crime. Two women just going quietly about their business, shot dead in what appears to be an execution-style double murder. And we'll keep an eye on that, and we'll see what happens in the weeks and months to come. Jack, Nick McKenzie, as we mentioned before, always a busy boy. There's been a joint 60 Minutes 9 media investigation led by him, which has revealed that exploitation of the National Disability Insurance Scheme is costing taxpayers up to $1 billion a year, including, and these $1 billion have not been nickel and dimed by general citizens, but that this has been subject to exploitation by organised crime groups, Jack.
Well, history would tell us that whenever and whenever a government brings in a new entitlement, there will be people who will test the limits of that entitlement by getting what they can out of it.
And in such a way, Jack, that this is organised. So we're not talking about nickel and dime fraud, as I say. This is it is being preyed upon by organised crime. This is what the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commissioner Chief Michael Fallon said. He described the rorting as fraudulently skimming, being used for the wholesale purchase of narcotics from overseas. So this is the exploitation of the NDIS is being used almost like a means to obtain cash, to go on and purchase narcotics, and to obtain seed funding for their organised criminals' broader illegal activity. The crime fighting boss said his agency had detected ghosting or the creation of fake NDIS clients, the systemic inflating of invoices, payment for services that are never provided, and networks of facilitators, including doctors, pharmacists, training facilities, accountants and lawyers who help criminals exploit the scheme. And Michael Fallon has called for a multi-agency task force to combat the problem. A minister for the NDIS and the founder of it, Bill Shorten, said, "I think any dollar which gets ripped off between taxpayers and people on the schemes is too high." He told he said this with an interview with Patricia Carvelis this morning. "I think there is a problem." He said, "I said it before the election, and since the election, I've started alerting colleagues, pushing the agency and talking to state ministers about the need for government agencies to work together to combat the scourge of fraud." Shorten said the NDIS rorting appears to be occurring in two or three ways. He said one was through coercion, this is the quote, and other criminal tactics, accessing the accounts and putting in invoices. So that's one way. But he said, I also suspect that there's ghosting where false invoices and false clients might be made up. I want to find out if that's true, but then there's another way. It's just the padding of bills by people who might be not connected to organised crime, but they're just robbing the scheme. I also worry that the fraud or overpayment is occurring through a lack of scrutiny of the invoices. Shorten accused the Morrison government of making it harder for genuine people to get onto the NDIS as an easy fix to chasing actual fraud. He went on to say, I'm meeting the agency today. I want to satisfy myself that the resources for fraud detection are what they should be. And if we need more resources, we have to find them because, frankly, it'll pay for itself if we could stop some of the money being ripped off. And that is, Jack, you would understand that the NDIS, people with serious disabilities are being held off the scheme because there's not enough money in it. But here we see over $1 billion plus estimated going out of the scheme every year due to criminal activity and often organised criminal activity.
This would be something I'd approach with caution, to be honest. Like I said, every time governments start a new scheme, whether it's compensation for motor vehicle accident victims or a new workers' compensation scheme, there are attempts to push the boundaries. And on a number of occasions in the past, people have made allegations that there's wide-scale systemic fraud going on, but they very rarely ever stack up when the investigation's completed. So I'd be cautious about this.
I'd just like to make a comment that fraud, general fraud, is rarely investigated unless it reaches a certain level of money lost. That the police, because fraud is such a difficult investigation, requires enormous resources and manpower from police, that if you, for example, or if a person, for example, was had defrauded a company of, say, let's say $20,000, the police would not necessarily get involved. And that's because they simply don't have the resources to conduct an investigation which would lead to a prosecution.
Do you remember the allegations? I think it was called the Greek conspiracy case, and I think it involved motor vehicle accidents, but there were allegations that there was a whole systemic corruption thing going on with motor vehicle accident, personal injuries compensation in and around Sydney. And there was a big splash story, a bit like this one, and in the end it sort of went nowhere.
Yeah, I would simply say, if you're looking at a relatively low scale fraud, you are probably you might suffer some form of kickback. You might be kicked off the NDIS, for example, if you're overcharging on invoices and those sorts of things. But it's almost that sort of low level fraud is not going to lead to criminal charges being laid. I hope I haven't told our listeners that they can probably get away with a bit of fraud as long as it's not too big. But it is the case. I can tell you for a certainty.
Yeah, well, certainly there will be people who are pushing the boundaries on the NDIS, because there are people who push the boundaries on every government entitlement scheme.
Yeah,
but I'm just instinctively cynical that it's a widespread systemic approach, because that's very hard to pull together. There's too many moving parts. I might be wrong, but I would approach this with caution.
Look, I would say, Jack, that it's actually very rare for us to hear from Michael Phelan, the Commissioner of the Australian of the ACIC. It's an organisation that essentially operates in secret, and it's very, very rare. If he's called for a multi-agency task force to combat the problem, if he is of the genuine view that money being skimmed out of the NDIS is of sufficient quantity to be used as sort of seed funding for organised criminal networks, then that would be a pretty good thing to do. But yes, we'll keep an eye on that story. I'm sure there's more. Nick often releases on the Sunday with the
follow up to come.
Yeah, with the follow up to come. So I'm sure there'll be some more coming along the way, Jack. And moving on now, one of the really big stories of the weekend. Now, we used to call Russ Hinds the Minister for Everything, Jack, didn't we? He was the Minister for, I think, police, roads, local government.
Very importantly, the Minister for Racing.
He was indeed the Minister for Racing. He was indeed the Minister for Racing during the fine cotton fiasco. But he wasn't at the time the Minister for Police because he was quite unhappy with the dodgy commissioner at the time and made that clear. So the dodgy commissioner at the time went to Joe and said, I can't work with this bloke. So Russ lost the job and he was the minister for almost everything. But Scott Morrison, Jack, has he taken a leaf out of Russ's book? Because he was, as we understand it, the Minister for Prime Minister, Minister for Health, Minister for Industry and Resources, and Minister for Finance, Jack. And furthermore, with the exception of the actual Minister for Health, Greg Hunt, none of the other ministers seem to know. It's very odd.
It is bizarre, isn't it?
It's really strange. What do you think he was doing? What sort of mentality are we working with here, Jack?
Well, this happened at the outbreak of COVID in Australia, so they were strange times, and there were a lot of, I wouldn't say shortcuts, but there were a lot of concerns about how to get the government response to work. Government isn't really designed to operate as quickly as that. As quickly as was needed to be done. But this, even by those standards, this seems quite bizarre.
So, as I understand the timing on this, that Greg Hunt was advised that Scott Morrison wanted to be the Minister for Health too, and that decision was made in March 2020, as you say, a difficult time and a time of great unknown in terms of how destructive the pandemic was going to be. But then, and assumed the role of Minister for Finance at the same time. And then in April 2021, we're still in the midst of the pandemic, but we had a greater view of what was coming and what was not. He was sworn in by the Governor General, David Hurley, as the Minister for Industry and Resources.
Yeah, it's bizarre.
And the Nationals. And the existing Nationals minister said, didn't know for a long time. That's very strange.
It also strikes me as, on the face of it, as being unnecessary. There's a thing called the Acts Interpretation Act, which sort of, it's a lawyer special. It sort of governs how you look at administrative decisions made by the government, and that allows a minister, if they're for any reason, really, to appoint somebody to act in their place, to act as their delegate.
Right.
There would be no reason why Health Minister Hunt couldn't appoint the Prime Minister to act as Health Minister while he was sick.
Well, if he had COVID, that's the
yeah.
design. That was the design of it. That if Greg Hunt fell to COVID, then that Scott Morrison would jump forward. But you're saying that basically there is provision for that.
Or already on the books. Yeah. The other thing that's bizarre about it is that normally the appointment of ministers is mentioned in the Government Gazette and Parliament's informed, and none of these things seem to have happened. I was watching the television this morning. A very distinguished professor of constitutional law, Professor Anne Toomey, said she'd been looking through the gazettes and she couldn't find it. She said, I'm not absolutely certain it's not there, but I couldn't find it on a read this morning. So,
well, you'd think if she's had a decent look, it's just not there.
It seems unlikely that it was dealt with in the usual way, that is, by being put in the Government Gazette, Parliament being told about it. None of this seems to have happened.
It would seem that just David Hurley, the Governor-General, is simply just acting on government advice, so we can't really point a finger at him. If the Prime Minister says, I want you to swear me in as a Minister for everything, he's obliged to do so.
Yeah, he would. You would think he would say, "Are you sure?" But he would properly act on as he should on the Prime Minister's advice. Yeah.
And just this morning, on the 15th of August, it would seem that the Albanese government is considering whether to probe the legality of Scott Morrison's move. They're looking at a Office of Prime Minister and Cabinet investigation into this, is that he secretly swore himself in as Health and Finance Minister and Minister for Resources as well during the COVID-19 pandemic.
It seems unlikely to me that he's done anything illegal.
Constitutionally, there's no prevention. There's no limit.
It's a bit like Gough Whitlam and Lance Barnard getting appointed to all of the ministries in 1972 while they were waiting for the caucus to assemble to elect the ministry. It's a bit like, I think, after the last election, there were just 4 ministers appointed.
That's right.
So that Anthony Albanese and Penny Wong could head off to that meeting in Japan.
Correct,
So these things are unusual, but I don't think that makes them improper or illegal. It's just a bit bizarre.
The difference, obviously, between those two examples, Whitlam Barnard and Albanese and his 3 ministers being sworn in before the rest of Cabinet,
was that we all knew.
It was in the newspapers, Jack. It was on the television. And this is really bizarre. You don't think Scott Morrison's got the 3 or 4 ball bearings in the hand during the pandemic and go, a bit of a streak of autocracy had just crept into his methods.
Yeah. Well, there was a lot of strange things happened here. The bit that I liked in the paper this morning was talk about the crucial lessons from the 1919 pandemic. Chief among them was how federalism almost collapsed when the politicians let themselves believe they were medical experts. They needed a mechanism that put the expert health advice at the apex of political decision making. Now, I got to tell you, that's what Australia did wrong during the pandemic, was that it did put the health experts at the apex, and that's just wrong. These are political decisions and should have been made by the politicians, not by the health experts.
I think the point where I quibble about that is that it must rely on health advice. So the politicians have to make the announcements, but they must be doing so on the basis of the best health advice they can get.
I think that's wrong. Absolutely wrong. What you've got to do is you've got to make a political judgment. You listen to what the health experts say, then you make a political judgment as what's best for the country. And that's a political decision. It's not a health decision.
Yeah, I would say that it must rely on the best health advice you can get. I do know, and I've looked at the 1919 pandemic very closely, Jack, the states and territories as one at the time, said, yes, we will rely on the health department. Recently, and it had been created, the Federal Department of Health had been created, I think, in 2015, but certainly just a number of years before the pandemic hit. And they were all prepared and indeed sat down and signed a document saying that was going to be the driving force for their decision-making. And they essentially ceded responsibility for a lot of these things to the feds. And that stayed that way in a beautiful piece of conciliation until a couple of blokes wandered across the Victorian-New South Wales border, stepped across the Murray, and then turned up in Sydney with Spanish flu.
Spanish flu.
And then it was all every state for themselves. And it led to some really bizarre and very bad things, that there were camps outside borders. So the Queenslanders had closed their borders, and anyone who wanted to go in from Queensland couldn't go into Queensland from New South Wales. And we are talking about a large number of returned servicemen coming into the country, and they couldn't. So they had these camps, these sort of makeshift camps. There was another one on the South Australian-Victorian border and New South Wales border. And they were just awful places.
I think history will judge what happened during COVID as bizarre as well.
I think what I'm saying is that we really hadn't learned a whole lot in the space of 100 years, Jack, on pandemic management. I think that's my point, that the states got into a shit fight then, and they got into a shit fight this time.
And I would never say the High Court can be wrong, because it can't.
No,
it's not appellable, but it can be mistaken.
Like 17th century popes, Jack.
Yeah, but it can be mistaken, and I think they got a couple of cases wrong during this, because I think that the Section 92 freedom of commerce between the states should have prevailed over the health advice. Anyway,
Yeah, look, okay.
that's something for the historians to argue about later.
Yes, it is.
But,
But getting back to Scott Morrison, does he need to respond to this? I mean, surely he does. He's a member of Parliament still, for some reason.
I don't think there's nothing to compel him to respond to this, apart from embarrassment.
Yeah, that's just it. I mean, the guy basically hasn't made a public utterance, besides a few paid speeches in Japan and what have you. Hasn't made a public utterance since becoming an MP and sitting up in the back.
And the odd sermon at evangelical church.
Oh well, that's a normal Sunday morning, but
not for
every
me,
time he's been approached
by
by journalists for comment on a range of matters, he's going, not talking about it. I think he really does need. Yes, I know there's no legal compulsion on him, but I think he really does need to come forward and say, yes, it happened, and this is why I did it. Because
it's not just him. It appears that he was acting on advice from Christian Porter, who was Attorney General at the time.
Yeah, that's certainly been. I must say that this whole matter has been revealed as a result of Simon Benson's book, political editor at the Australian, and Simon's book was an extract of it was published in the Weekend Australian, and yes, that's quite true that Morrison had acted under the advice of Christian Porter, who's no longer a member of Parliament, but. Yeah, it just is the strangest thing.
You would think that there is some likelihood that advice from Christian Porter will find its way into the newspaper by some mysterious means.
Very
in
likely.
the next little while.
Off the back of the truck. Look at what we got here. Yeah, very, very strange indeed, Jack. Now, look, we're going to turn our attention now to listener letters, and it appears that we have a huge audience amongst the rural people and farmers in particular, Jack, on Hard Hats and High Vis. We heard from Lawrence a while back. Well,
you might have grown up in the wilds of Reservoir, but I'm a country boy through and through, or I was.
Talk about your reservoir. Talk about your criminal element there, Jack. I tell you what, the papers in Melbourne just. If you were a crook wanted or had been charged and you came from Reservoir, they just didn't even bother putting it. They would only give you a suburb if you weren't from Reservoir, because everyone. Anyway, Lawrence writes to us just in regard to your comments on Landline on the ABC TV show, and another listener has written us a similar letter. I'm not surprised, he says, that there are some people in Hong Kong who are fans. Landline's target audience is urban and, like most of ABC, is slanted more towards the progressive side. I wouldn't say it's compulsory viewing for actual farmers. There is some good ag current affairs and market information, a few great human family stories, but also a preponderance of others, highlighting the favoured buzzwords like sustainable, carbon, organic, non-industrial ag, regenerative, paddock to plate, food provenance. Yes, these are buzzwords in the agricultural industry, Jack. As I'm a farmer from central west New South Wales, Lawrence says, who has been involved in the land care movement for 30 years, that's not all bad. The vast majority of farmers I deal with are continually trying to improve their property's natural assets. It's just a shame it doesn't use the platform it has to dispel some of the urban ag myths. Converting cotton farms to hemp production wouldn't save the rivers. Almond milk isn't environmentally friendly. And as Sri Lanka proved, taking all of agriculture back 50 years will just mean more price increases, more hungry people and social dislocation. I much prefer the rural stories put together by the network of regional radio reporters that's put to air on the ABC in the country hour between 12 noon and 1 p.m. And he goes on to give us a bit of praise.
I grew up listening to the Country Hour.
Yes, I've listened to it numerous times, particularly on long trips into New South Wales and Victoria. So yes,
well, Lawrence does make some good.
He does make some very good points, but I'll just go on and read you a letter from Chrissy, who essentially makes the same point. She thinks that she was referring to the conditional release program and a program that was just made about the Uluru Statement and what that's about. But she goes on, a bit of feedback for the two Jacks regarding Landline. My husband and I are farmers. We rarely watch Landline. And in fact, we don't often listen to the rural reports on our local ABC radio. They have an obvious bias towards organic and regenerative farming and don't correct misinformation discussed by the people they interview on these topics. The organic and regenerative farming industry is full of anti-vaxxers. I want to talk about that in a minute because she's absolutely spot on, Jack. And conspiracy theorists, which makes me wonder why the ABC would give them so much time. Very lovely letter from Chrissy where she did say in regard to the conditional release program that she hoped we would go back to swearing again because we were off the swearing this week. And I can promise Chrissy that we will be. But yeah, two of our farming listeners there are making
Making good points.
Making good points that are in support of each other. That the program Landline is fixated on organic and regenerative farming, and not focusing enough on, I guess, what we would call mainstream farming, Jack.
Well, I'm right on their side. Organic's just a word that means cost twice as much and rubbish quality, you know.
Look, I do want to talk about this. It is a conditional release program. It is a conditional release program in the wheelhouse there, but we do find this too, that organic farming and regenerative farming, which for our urban listeners is basically this sort of holistic approach to farming, reduction of fertilisers, improving the soil, improving the environment you farm in. It is replete with anti-vaxxers and conspiracy theorists, Jack. And we see that at a retail level where organic, where there's an organic market, for example.
Oh, you can. They've done this in the United States. If you plot the children's vaccine, people who won't take the MMR,
or won't let their kids take it,
won't let their kids do it. If you plot those, they all cluster around Whole Food stores.
Yeah, I know. I mean, we had one in Bowral here, Jack, where it was shut down during lockdown, but they continued to open, and then they had problems with police because anyone who walked in with it wearing a mask was basically told to get out. and then it led to a rather, well, not an amusing scene, but it was a sort of cataclysmic scene where one of the fellows basically reached to take off the mask of a New South Wales police officer. And you don't do that, Jack.
Oh, yes, I remember that.
Yeah, you don't do that, Jack. And I think he was ultimately charged with assault police. And it just showed, that there's this very strong connection with organic farming and that anti-vax movement that's been a blight on Australian society since, going back many years, but intensifying since the arrival of the pandemic in 2020.
Oh, Jack, it goes back right back to the anti-fluoride people.
Well, you might have seen, Jack, that. Yes, well, the anti-fluoride people, yeah, so there's a very strong link there with the anti-daylight savings people in Queensland, Jack.
Yeah,
very strong.
Yeah,
and yes, if you head up to Byron, or in your case down to Byron, you'll find that there are many people there who think fluoride is the devil's work. Complete and utter nonsense that it is. Yeah, so there is that very strong connection. Look.
These used to be popular views right back in an organisation that you'll remember, I'm sure, called the League of Rights.
Yes, I do. In fact,
which dates back to the late 60s, early 70s.
I studied them in sociology, Jack. You weren't lucky enough to study sociology, let me tell you.
No, I'm afraid I didn't get that benefit, no.
It was all about, if you wrote an essay, if you didn't have a really strong Marxist tilting it, you weren't going to get marked very well. So I grasped that. I grasped that precondition pretty quickly.
So you jumped on board for the duration of the
I
course.
pretended to be a Marxist. I wouldn't say I was hand on heart, but I thought, well, I know, just when you type a sentence up, you like this, you like this. Anyway.
Now listen. I got some feedback this week.
Oh,
too.
did you?
Yeah, I did.
Just want before you start. I just wanted to say from Chrissy, who goes on and writes lovely things. You have created a must-listen podcast for me, and I enjoy listening each week. So isn't that nice? Good on you, Chrissy.
Excellent.
Now, what's your
The more
feedback?
we get, the better. Now, I got some feedback on. We had a little bit of a dig at Peter Fitzsimons last.
Just a tiny one, and we're not the only ones. Let's face it. There's a queue that forms to the left and goes all the way down to Portland.
Yeah, you're a little unkind about his books, and all I can say about that is anybody who can write books that people actually want to buy and read, that's a good.
Well, see, that's why I grind my teeth, Jack. Yeah, because the books I write, they don't sell nearly as well as Peter's.
No,
so that's that's just professional envy.
And I don't know whether they're any good because
haven't managed to buy one.
I haven't managed to buy one.
No, charge off to a bookshop and join the queue to buy a Peter Fitzsimons.
No, well, Peter Fitzsimons has some fans, and even amongst his fans, I got a couple of text messages saying, "Look, they really liked us having a go at him on the podcast, and they especially liked your column in the Australian on Friday."
Oh, excellent!
And I'd recommend our listeners have a good read. It was a beauty. But one of them pointed out what she thought was the best bit of the interview with Jacinta Price was at the end, where he says to her, honestly, in the silent watch of the night, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, as we all do. Do you ever have any doubts? Do you never think that in a seriously prominent and powerful position you are misusing the platform you have and are actually hurting Indigenous causes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And the feedback I got was, there's a missing bit there. And I said, what was that? He says, what he doesn't say is, I know I have doubts about whether I'm right.
You know why it's missing, Jack? Because he doesn't.
I think we all know.
He has no doubts. Once Peter Fitz comes up with a position, that's it. That's it.
That's absolutely.
And everyone else's position. No good.
Yeah.
Wrong.
So I thought. No. So that did make me laugh. And the other one, just to show our listeners that we're not fixated on the people in the 9 newspapers, I was equally taken with the Peter Van Onselen column where he came out in support of the sin taxes, and I wasn't the least bit surprised that he always looks like a sort of one of those temperance preachers, really, doesn't he? He's got that pinched look about him,
Well, look, I didn't read the column, which is remiss of me. I would refer our readers, or listeners, I should say, to having a read of Chris Kenny's column about Peter Fitz as well. It was very, very good. And Chris, of course, is a member of the expert council on bringing the voice to the Parliament and to the people.
But the Fitz column was a triumph of a complete lack of self-reflection on the part of
the interview, not my column, I hope. But they're absolutely right. And the length of the questions, Jack, this is the thing. A good interviewer, it's a sentence or two. Not this long preamble every time. Oh, do you ever wonder when you're staring at the cracks in the ceiling? If you're being interviewed like that, you're wanting to come in. You've got something to say, and you've got to bite your lip for a good 2 minutes while he finishes the question.
Well, that's because the question is more important than the person answering.
I've always thought the best interviewer in this country is Richard Feidler, Jack. Now, he's a mate and a co-author of mine, so I'll put that up front. But listeners who listen to the conversations on the ABC, and Richard sort of does, I think, every second one these days. He used to do them all. He's just one of these guys who knows his subject so well, knows the subject matter so well, and it's really just his questions are a way of educing a response from the interview subject every time. It's not he doesn't want to make a point. He's not there to make points. He's not there to argue a position. He's saying to the interviewer, I want our listeners to hear what you have to say. And that's what makes a good interviewer.
And he doesn't have to be the star of every episode. That's the difference.
That's the thing, isn't it? It's ego. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The best.
But the Peter Van Onselen thing.
What did he say? I haven't read it.
He was acknowledging that there's a lot of people in the Labor Party who find that the sin taxes are regressive. That is, they're a tax on the poor.
Right.
You know, and that's
so
true.
When we
They
talk
genuinely
about sin taxes, we're talking about gaming, alcohol, tobacco,
cigarettes, yeah, all that sort of stuff. But the conclusion he seems to come to is that sure they are a tax on the poor, but they're good for the poor people.
Oh, look, and who knows? He might have met one, you know, at some point in his life.
Yeah, perhaps. Yeah.
Maybe someone driving him.
Only by accident, you know.
All right, now Jack, and for our listeners, Jack reckons. He's put literally thousands of dollars on the table, and he will be buying me a lunch very, very soon because Jack doesn't think electric vehicles will take off. But he's found an enemy, a bitter enemy in Josh Frydenberg. Because Josh is a big spruiker for EVs. We go on. We've got some stats here in Australia. I think 0.8% of new vehicles purchased in 2020 were EVs. Now it's up to 2, so it's more than doubling every year. But we are coming from a very low basis. Adam Morton in The Guardian says. But now Josh is all over it, mate. Or he was.
He was indeed. The thing that concerned me about this is not that he was the federal treasurer at the time he was saying this, but that he's a Carlton supporter.
He's Carlton, a good, very fine Carlton man.
Yeah, and I'm just beginning to wonder whether Princess Park's going to have charging stations out the front there.
You won't be able to get the car park unless you drive one.
Yeah, well, that's a concern to me, you know. As I was an habitué of Princess Park back in the days when you could watch the games there.
That lunch, I said by the end of the year, I think probably by October you'll be buying me a very, very expensive lunch.
Okay, well, it might be, but as long as I haven't got to buy one for Josh as well. You know,
that's going to cost you a few bob more. That's true.
Now speaking of Carlton, has there ever been a better home and away game than the ones coming up?
Well, the old enemy, Collingwood, got a win to be in, and that is presuming that the Western Bulldogs beat Hawthorn in Launceston on Sunday, which has been a bit of a cruel sea for a lot of AFL teams going there. It can be pretty bleak and cold and windy at Launceston, and the Hawks do okay there.
It's country footy. It's not in a big stadium, so if the wind's howling, it's like country footy. There really is a 4-goal win.
I do remember. I think Buddy kicked 15 against North Melbourne there when North popped along to Launceston and jogged out thinking, we might be playing a bit of country footy today, but came up against the Hawks in very fine form and Buddy with a kicking boot on. Look, it was a great round of footy, just AFL round 22. Disappointing if you're a Carlton fan because we fell 5 points short against Melbourne at the G on Saturday night. Carlton's effort was excellent. I really no criticism. Should they have hung on to the ball for that last 30 seconds a little better? But yes, sure. But that's just the way it goes. There were each side, Jack, had 3-figure tackle counts.
Yeah, it was a hot game.
And that takes you back to the old Eagles Swans time. I mean, I'm not putting them in the same league there because West Coast Eagles, well, Melbourne are premiership side, West Coast Eagles in that era were too, as were the Swans. But yeah, those you used to get 100 plus tackle counts fairly regularly, and that happened on Saturday night. Doesn't happen very often in footy these days. Carlton must beat Collingwood.
It was real finals footy. It was real finals footy.
3:20 on Sunday, the 21st of
And
August. Carlton will run out to
and
play Collingwood.
if Collingwood win, they're in the top four.
Yeah, so they've got to put the play forward, yeah.
And if Carlton win, they're playing finals.
That's exactly right. So they'll get a few there. They might get a bit of a following along both sides. Collingwood, I think, have got a membership rate well into the 90s, and Carlton, it's a home game for Carlton, by the way. Their membership's now over 80,000. So you can't fit 170 in, but they will have probably 90,000 there, Jack.
Yeah, which is terrific to see. And I watched the Michael Voss interview afterwards, and he said, "Look, just rapt to be in that situation. Great for the development of the team and the club. You can't get any better than that."
I mean, win, lose, or draw, this sort of experience is absolutely crucial to a developing list, play in front of 90,000 people in a must-win game.
With a lot at stake.
So much, yeah. You call it a must-win, but a lot at stake. Yeah, look, absolutely right. There'll be a huge crowd there. Can I offer you one scenario, Jack? Carlton beats Collingwood, gets into the finals, finishes 8th, Collingwood 5th, and play again the following week at the G.
Yeah, could happen.
It wouldn't be short odds, but it could easily happen. We're not quite sure who's going to. Well, we know Geelong will finish top. They're 2 wins ahead of everybody else. Sydney currently second. They play the Saints on the weekend. Should win that at Marvel. I think that's that. And then really it depends. Freo should win. You would think Richmond, who play Richmond. I can't remember who they play, but they should win. They should finish 7th. But that 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is really up for grabs at the moment.
It is indeed. It should be a cracking final series.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, you've seen Geelong play a few times now. I've seen them play probably 8 or 10 times this year. Are they really 2 games better than Sydney, Melbourne, etc.? Brisbane Lions?
The 3 sides who seem to be going best at the moment to me are probably Geelong, Sydney and Richmond.
Well, Geelong, they haven't had a loss for a long time. Their contested footy game just looks to be a little bit better than everybody else's, and harder, longer, if you like, Jack. And there's no shortage of talent up forward with the 2 big blokes there. But also Tyson Stengel has just been a recruit this year to Geelong, who's just been a goal kicking machine, and this is huge active small forward. There's not a lot wrong anywhere when you look at them. Their defence is outstanding with Stewart and De Koning as their tools. They don't seem to have a weakness to me. But as you pointed out in our pre-show chat, they'll be playing their finals at the G, not at Conditional Park.
Yes, so I believe. I believe because of the building works down there that there will be no tripping down to Conditional Park to play a final.
Can't have a final where when you kick a goal, they got a workman from the building site go and get the footy. Can't have that. No. All right. No, that's terrific. And thank you very much, Jack. And thank you for our listeners' letters. Thank you, Chrissy. And thank you, Lawrence. And that is the show for today. Other than to say, we do want your feedback, and we would love to hear, even if it's vicious and awful and threatening, we would love to hear from you on the Conditional Release Program at gmail.com. Drop us a line anytime. Tell us if you're enjoying the show or if you're not, and where we can improve. Yes, we would love to hear from you anyway. You can hit me up on Twitter as well at Jack the Insider. My DMs are open. Jack, wonderful to have you along. What's on in Hong Kong this week, mate?
Oh, it's still hot and steamy, but you know, September's the turnaround month. It starts getting a little bit better.
And are they going to have the Super 8? Is that going ahead, or no announcement yet?
Oh, the sevens.
Oh, 7. Sorry, God.
Yeah. The sevens are scheduled for November. and they keep telling us they're going to happen, but there are a few cynics around town who think it's just not going to work. But
It'll be a dry old weekend in Hong Kong that weekend, Jack.
well, it's the changes in the quarantine law, which is now 3 days hotel quarantine and 4 days based at home, but you're allowed to go out anywhere else pretty much apart from a gym, a pub or a restaurant. That's going to make things a little bit easier for people coming in and out of the country, for Hong Kongers coming in and out of the country. But it's not going to do anything for the tourism.
I don't
industry.
think there's any appetite in team sport to go back to the old COVID bubbles anymore. We saw Meg Lanning, the captain of the Australian women's cricket team. She's jumped out of the game. You would have seen that, Jack. She's just resting and saying publicly that she wants to spend some time on herself. Make a very good argument that she's been the most successful captain of any team sport in the world, basically, in any code, any sport. She's basically rounded off a very tough season, often a very tough few years, winning the World Cup T20, winning the 50 over World Cup, and then winning the Ashes, and most of that spent in COVID bubbles.
Yeah, I personally, I doubt that they're going to persuade enough teams to want to come up here and be in a bubble here while the sevens are on, even if it's only for a couple of days.
Fair enough.
And they certainly won't persuade. I mean, the sevens relies on a lot of people coming back to Hong Kong or visiting Hong Kong to make it the big event it is. And that's just not going to happen unless the quarantine rules change.
Fair enough. Now, I just want you to respond to my hyperbole, Jack. Is Meg Lanning the best captain of any sport going around, and has been for the last few years? Certainly, she's I think she's captained Australia more times than any captain of Australia, with the exception of R. Ponting and I think S. Ward. Might be Alan Border. But yeah, she's just been superb.
Done a great job.
Yeah, all right. Thanks very much, Jack. We'll catch you next week on Hard Hats and High Vis. See you later, listeners.
Cheers.